Alright, so we're in Xcode, and what I want to do is demonstrate these model view controller concepts that we've just been talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and start a new project, an Xcode project, and I'm going to be building an iOS application this time. And so as you can see, I want to select application under iOS, and we're going to build a single view application tonight. So I'm going to select single view application, and we'll call this the greeting app. I'll call it my greeting app, and it's going to be implemented in Swift, and I'm going to support only the iPhone at this time. So I'm going to select that and create it. And now we've got an empty app, and just to demonstrate what we've got here by default, I'm going to run it. And it starts an emulator, an iPhone 6 emulator, and it's just a blank screen, which is correct because I haven't really done anything. So it's a fully functional app, it's just not very interesting at this point. So I'm going to add some things to the screen first of all. So this is not uncommon when we start working on an iOS application. We often will be an interface builder, kind of mocking up the screen, the views if you will, and then we'll go into Xcode and start wiring things up. So I'm going to go over to my main.storyboard, the storyboard that got created, and we see just a single view controller. Now notice that over here there is a view controller that's got created for me by the project creation wizard here. So I've got a view controller that's kind of stubbed out here, and it's actually hooked up to this view that we see. So the way we can tell this is if I click this view and then I go over here to my utility panel and I click the identity inspector. So this is the third one, the third icon there. And if you look, the very first thing you see is a custom class, and you'll see it's set to a class named view controller. So what we've done there is we've associated this view hierarchy, which is empty right now, with this piece of code out here, this particular view controller. Okay? So that's kind of pre-wired up for us. If I were to add a new screen, then I would need to add a new controller and make that association myself manually. All right? So this is kind of done for us so we don't have to do it, but keep in mind as we start writing bigger apps that have multiple screens, we're going to have to start doing this ourselves. But right now, we're all hooked up and ready. So let's go back and let's make some changes to the user interface. The application here is going to be a greeting app. And so what it's going to do is it's going to greet the user, but not until the user does something. Okay, so we want to do a couple things. We want to first of all get something on the screen, okay, and we're going to have kind of a default reaction. It's just like you walk into a party and there's one person there beside yourself, and you stand there and the other person maybe just is cold as ice, right? And they don't do or say anything until you actually walk over and hold out your hand and say, "Hi, I'm Jonathan, what's your name?" And all of a sudden they light up like a Christmas tree and they start talking to you and having a great time, right? So that's what our app's going to do. It's going to come up and it's just going to sit there like, and not until we push a button and interact with it is it actually going to light up and do something. So we'll kind of see what does it take to get something on the screen, then how can we interact, let the user do something, and then how can we respond to that user interaction. So by doing this, we're going to show you how to wire up an Outlook, or an outlet, okay, and how to set up an action. All right, so let's do it. We're going to start with what's called a label, and a label is a component that lets us simply put text up on a screen. So we're going to wire a label up, and I'm going to drag that label over here, and I'm going to kind of see these little blue lines. These are guides that kind of tell you the standard position to put things from the edges of the screen. So I'm just going to put it right there. Now, I'm going to just let this thing run on an iPhone 6 in portrait orientation. So there's a whole gob of stuff we have to learn about. How do you get stuff to like lay out properly on the screen? If I change the orientation, there's all kinds of magic that we have to learn to make that all happen. But for right now, we're just going to put stuff really carefully on the screen. So by default, it comes up on a normal looking iPhone 6 in portrait just fine. Okay? And for your homework today as well, that's all we're going to worry about. Okay? Next time we'll start talking about, okay, how do we make this stuff so it's more flexible and we can rotate the phone and we can do all kinds of stuff and get it to show up right. Okay? So right now we're just going to focus on getting stuff on the screen, hooking it up to the controller, adding actions, etc., etc. We're not going to worry about how pretty it looks. So there's my label, and I'll just leave, by default, the label comes up with the standard text. It just says label. And I can go over here to the attributes editor, and I could change that if I wanted. In fact, I could change all kinds of properties on that label without even writing any code, just by going into this panel over here. Looks like a 747 cockpit. Lots of controls and buttons, and we'll start to learn those one by one. But for now, I'm just going to leave it as is. So there is my label. The other thing I want to do is I want to create a model. So this is a view, and now it's got something on the screen. So if I run this app, again, notice now that label is up there in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. But I want to create my model now. Okay, so we've got a view controller. We've got a view hierarchy. And now I want to create a model. And I'm going to represent my model as simply a string. And my model is going to represent the data that's on the screen. This is a really simple app, I told you. It's just going to have a reaction. So my model is simply a string property on the controller. So I'm going to go into my controller code, and I'm going to add a property. So I'll say var, and we'll call this thing my greeting, and we'll type it to be string, and I'm going to set it to stony awkward silence. Okay, we've just arrived at the party, and the other person at the party, the only other person besides ourselves, greets us with a stony, awkward silence. They're not looking too friendly. And what I want to do now is I want to set my model. When my view loads, I want to set the model, because the view needs to get data from the model. So in my controller, there is this method, viewDidLoad, and that would be the perfect place to load up my model. All right? Now this is an incredibly simple model. I just set it in memory and said, here's its value. But you could imagine a model could be really complicated. A model might be the 50 most recent tweets from Twitter. And so what I might need to do there is in my viewDidLoad, I might have to do some type of network fetch, get the data, and then store it in some kind of database or some type of data structure. All right? So we typically kick that off when the view loads. Okay, once the view loads, it means, hey, it's gonna show up any second on the screen. It's just loaded from the interface builder file. So let's go get the data. Or if I wanted to be really snappy, I might have, the last time my app ran, I might have stored it in a local database or in flash memory. And so it's kind of cached. So I might immediately load that up because it's fast and then start the network fetch. Okay? So keep in mind, I'm just trying to show you the three moving parts here in their relationships, but in reality, that model could be a lot more complex. So I've got the model. Now what I want to do is I want to tell the view hierarchy that its string is, its model data is stony awkward silence. But the question is, how do I get to that label out there in my view? I dropped this beautiful label up into my view. How do I get at it? Okay? And I need to use an outlet. I need to create an outlet. So to create an outlet, we're going to go back into the storyboard, and then we're going to go into a special configuration here in Xcode. So let me go full screen so I got more space. And I want to go in what's called the Assistant Editor. So you can see up here in the upper right, it's the button with the two intersecting circles on it. So when I click that, watch what happens. It puts side by side the view controller, the view that I had selected and its respective controller code over on the right. So all I need to do is make sure that the label is selected. Then I'm going to hold the control button and I'm going to drag with my mouse over to my class. Okay. See what I'm doing there? And then it kind of it updates there and says, hey, let me see if I can make this a little bigger so those of you in the back can see it. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit here, select my button, click and drag, and then I'm going to release. And a little window pops up. And it says, oh, you want to create an outlet, don't you? And what do you want to call this outlet? Well, I'm going to call it my greeting label, because that's what it is. I'll give it a nice descriptive term. And then I'll simply say, notice the type. It figured that out all by itself. I'm going to say connect, and it adds some code. Okay? Now some of this you're going to recognize, and some of it you won't. But first of all, it puts this @IB outlet on there, and that's just a special decoration that tells Xcode, hey, this thing's an outlet. That means it's actually wired up to something inside the storyboard. And you can tell by this little dot right here. See that little dot with a circle in it? Okay, if it's hooked up, there's going to be a circle with a little black dot in it. And if I move over that, you can see the respective component over in the view hierarchy light up. You see that? Now this is real simple. It's the only thing I got out there. But imagine if I had 20 or 30 different things out here, and I got a class here with 20 or 30 outlets. This is kind of nice. I can kind of see, okay, what one is that again? Oh yeah, that's that one, right? And some of this other, like weak here, this we'll talk about this later. So push this on your stack, and we'll talk about, this has to do with memory management and who's responsible for keeping track of this thing, and we'll talk about it later. But the rest of this, you understand. We've seen all this syntax. This says it's a property. Its name is greeting label. Its type is UI label, which is the type in the actual UI kit framework from Apple. And then there's the bang on. What does the bang on the end of it mean? It means it's going to implicitly unwrap. Okay, so if we pass this thing to wherever a UI label is expected, it's going to implicitly unwrap it. We don't have to unwrap it manually. All right? And remember, we said that that's kind of a risky proposition because you can only do that bang if you know it's really got something. But guess what? When this thing loads, the underlying frameworks are going to set this variable to be referring to the thing out in Interface Builder. And it's going to do it, and it's going to do it right. So we can be sure once our view loads and we dereference this thing implicitly, it's going to work, okay? Because it's going to get something. All right. Now, if we forgot to hook it up, or we could actually manually delete this if we wanted to, then we'd get an error the first time we reference this variable. We'd get an exception, our program would crash, which is exactly what we'd want it to do. If we had something here that wasn't hooked up, we really want it to crash because we don't deserve to run, right? We want to fail, and we want to fail fast. Okay? So I've just hooked up this outlet now, and it's a property, so I can now reference this in my model code. So let's go back to our code editor mode here, and we'll go down into the model, or I'm sorry, into the controller, and inside the view did load, this is the appropriate point to load the model up, and we've already done that because it was just such a simple model. But we can also tell the view hierarchy now that, hey, we got your data. And what we want to do is we want to stuff that message from our model, that greeting, onto the greeting label. And we can do that by simply saying self, it's a property, dot greeting label, and a UI label, this is something you can look up in the documentation, but it has an attribute called text that we can use to set the textual value that that label is displaying. And what do I want to set it to? I want to set it to my other property, my model value, which is just greeting. All right, so now if we run this, up pops our simulator, and now it greets us with stony, awkward silence. Now, we want to interact with this application. So we want to put something up there that actually does something. We want to put a button on the screen because buttons are fun. We can push them. So we'll go back into our storyboard, and if we go down to our object library down there in the lower right, you'll see an object here called button. So I'm going to grab that button and I'm going to place it right underneath that label. So over to the left, and I see those little guidelines. I'm just going to go by those. I'll make it a little bit bigger, and then I'd like to change the value on this button. And since buttons labels usually don't change programmatically, they do sometimes. In one of our examples tonight, we're going to change the button label. But for this one, it's always going to say, please greet me, all right, because that's what we want it to do. So I'm going to go into my attribute editor here, or attribute inspector, and down here where the default name button is, I'm just going to say, please greet me. And when I tab out of that field, it is changed. Okay, and that's good enough. Now what I want to do is I want my controller to do something when the user presses that. Maybe before we do that, let's just run and show you that this button is in fact up there and it behaves differently. So there it is. And notice when I click on the label, nothing happens, right? Because it's just a label. It's not designed to respond to touches. But when I touch the button, watch what happens. See that? It's actually showing me, it's kind of fading out and back in every time I touch it. All right? Okay, so now what we want to do is we want some code to be executed whenever that button's pressed. How do we do that? Well, we do it exactly like we did the outlet, only now we're going to add, instead of an IB outlet, we're going to add an IB action, which is a method on the controller that gets called whenever the button is pressed. It's as easy as that. So we'll go back over here to our assistant editor, and we'll select the button, and I'll drag control click, drag over here. Okay, and notice this time on my little pop-up, by default it still thinks I want to do an outlet. So if I just went with the default here, it would add another property with whatever name I wanted of type UI button. But I don't want an outlet, I want an action. So I go to this drop down and I say do an action, and then I give it a name, and we'll say button pressed. That's the name of my action. And then there's a parameter, the type of the object of the sender. So when I actually call the view controller, not only do I get the invocation, but I'll get a reference to the UI button that actually caused this to happen. Okay, so if I wanted to do something to that button, disable it, change it, I could actually. So I want to change this type to be UI button. And the event here is touch up inside. So if somebody puts their finger on the button and lets go while they're still in the button, it's going to give me a button press event. So we'll connect this, and sure enough, it's stubbed out a new method, and you can see that it's hooked up because it's got this little dot by it. And this time it's got this IB action, and again, that's just a special marker for Xcode to know that, hey, this is an action that's wired up to something out in the view hierarchy. The name of the method is button pressed, and I get a single parameter as input, the sender, who's ever sending me that event, and it's typed to UI button because that's what I specified. So now I can put some code in here, and I'd like to do something very similar to what we did before. I want to change the model. Okay, so the button happens, so we're going to update the model. So I can say self.greeting is equal to, and then I'll just set whatever I want it to be. And I want it to be a warm Welcome, sir. Okay, so now it's happy. It's going to put out a nice greeting. And in order to get this to actually display, so now my model is updated, and to get it to display, I need to go to my label. So I'll go to the greeting label and its text attribute, and I'll set it once again to my greeting. Okay, now if I run, pops up, and if I click on the button, I get a warm welcome.